Hello and welcome everyone to our special Focus 100-pounder meeting. It is Wednesday, the 24th of January, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Geraldine O. Geraldine is originally from Kilkenny, now lives in County Waterford, and has been in OA since October of 2020. And Geraldine, we would love to hear your story.
Thank you, Noel, and hi everyone. Very humbled to be here, and thank you for asking me to be here. Roy, if you could just give me a reminder when there's about 2 minutes to go, that would be great, so I can be wrapping up. Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Geraldine. I'm a gratefully recovered compulsive overeater, and like Noel said, I came to my first OA meeting back in October 2020, and thankfully, you know, I have been miraculously, my life has miraculously changed in every way. So I suppose just to go back a little bit on the 45 years prior to that, I believe I was born a compulsive overeater just from things that my mother has said about me as a baby. And I know not everybody has that, but she definitely has reminisced on the fact that the only thing that would soothe me was food or milk. I believe I was combination fed because I just couldn't be satisfied in any way from the moment I was born. And I suppose I have an awareness of reaching for food at every opportunity. I had a pretty normal Irish childhood. But you know, I suppose when I think back, so there was no great tragedy. Thankfully, you know, I have a brother and a sister. You know, we as we were in the 70s or 80s, you know, we were fine. We didn't want for anything, but you know, we had a very simple childhood. But I definitely remember most of my memories are around food. If I think about a party, it's about the cake. You know, my brother's friends asking for more food, which meant we as his sisters had to wait. So there's definitely lots of food memories. And from an early age, I definitely have memories of my mother trying to encourage me to eat not quite as much as what I was having. She could obviously see that I was eating more than what I needed to. Looking back at photos, I wasn't a particularly large child. Most of that came in my teens. So I would have been very academic and not sporty at all, and would have struggled a bit at school with probably trying to play down that academic side of things. So it would have meant that at times school was hard because I took great pride in my schoolwork, but that's not necessarily a good strategy to choose for popularity and for keeping under the radar, if I'm being honest. And I definitely used food to soothe. I went to college, and I suppose away from my mother's, I suppose, control and cooking, it meant I had this whole freedom from coming home to, you know, only being given healthy meals, which probably kept my weight somewhat in check, though I do remember being on diets from a very early teen. But definitely at college and when I, you know, lived away from home working, I had this whole new freedom around food, and boy did I eat. I probably realized, like I said, from my early teens, there was a lot of dieting going on to reduce my weight. And I would characterize a lot of my early eating career as, you know, gaining probably 6 stone over a period of time and then losing 4. And that happened a lot. You know, firstly, when I was in my final year of college and I was applying for postgrad programs, my mother used a lot of the frothy emotional appeal, which only came from a place of love, that in a job interview it would be better if I looked a bit healthier. So that was my first attempt at that in my final year of my degree, and went to one of those private pay and weigh type situations. Was successful enough that they had me on the local radio promoting the product. But I went back in, you know, and regained that weight, lost it again, regained it. I met my husband when I was in my final year of college, when I was 20, and I met him when I was at my lightest adult weight. And it's ironic. I suppose I used to say to him at times, he's tall and lean, and really didn't like the fact that I was carrying extra weight at all. But I wasn't the first night we met. But over time, I did gain that weight. We got married 9 years later. I was living in Dublin. He was living down here on the Waterford farm. And again, many years of dieting up and down. And specifically for the wedding, I would have tried to diet, lost some of the weight, but not all of it, or didn't get to a healthy weight, but looked well enough on my wedding day. Then came to the time of having children. At that stage, my psoriasis had developed into psoriatic arthritis, which had an impact on my ability to, it affected my knees particularly. So at that point, I had looked at curing arthritis the drug-free way, which did look at a lot of inflammatory foods. And a lot of this makes a lot of sense now, because the foods that I was eating and that I now know I'm addicted to, white sugar, white flour, and huge volumes. I also have an intolerance to nuts, which I ate a huge amount of those, but they caused me a huge amount of pain, and really I suppose my inflammation was very, my body was very sore as a result. So I would have had times where I didn't eat those foods and had a lot of relief from my pain. A rheumatologist I met at the time told me there were drugs out there, but given I was 29 and hadn't yet had any children, they wouldn't have been recommended for me. This would have been about 20 years ago. So anyway, time went on, we decided we'd like to have children. But unfortunately, the extra weight, did have an impact, and I suffered lots of pregnancy losses as a result. So I managed to white knuckle it for a time, because the advice all the time was try to lose the weight. So despite at that stage probably being 8 to 9 stone over a healthy weight, I might lose about 4 and manage to maintain a healthy pregnancy, and I managed to have 3 healthy children, thankfully. After my youngest, who's now 9, was a year old, I was coming, I was within 14 months of my 40th birthday, and I decided this is it. I'm going to lose a pound a week, nice and easy. And instead, I gained 3 stone because that's what I did. And that continued. We had a family wedding, went to a pay and weight, gained more weight because the more I focused on it, and I didn't have those very important milestones. And I suppose the disease was progressing. So while I was able to lose 4 stone for my wedding and prior to maintaining a successful pregnancy, I always gained 6. So at this stage, things were getting worse and worse. I was now on fairly severe medication, methotrexate and some biologic injections for my arthritis. At this stage, I'd spoken to the doctor about it, and the practice nurses had recommended that I talk to somebody. So I did. I went to see a psychotherapist. And about 6 months, and that was in early 2019, about 6 months into therapy, I admitted to her that I was addicted to certain foodstuffs. And she told me about OA. She had many decades of recovery in another 12-step program herself. At that time, I'm living in County Waterford, and I thought, oh no, I won't be able to drive to those meetings. My children were a bit younger, and I didn't. But she told me about the steps, and I thought I can do this myself. I just won't eat sugar. I know the answer. I'm like an alcoholic, so I can't have these substances. That's it. Self-knowledge. Even though I didn't really know what I was thinking, that's what I thought. So for about 6 months, I didn't eat obvious sugar. So I stayed away from chocolate bars, and I lost about 10 pounds. And then I started to gain weight again because there were obviously all the other food substances and the volume. So I was knee deep in those. And then COVID hit in early 2020. And I was really frightened at that stage because there was a lot made about the people with compromised immune systems and high BMI. So I had both of those. I had high blood pressure as well and was on a tablet for that. And yeah, so I was really frightened. My GP told me to come off my medication for the arthritis because he said, your immune system is compromised, but at least, maybe this is the time. He said, maybe this will do it for you. Start walking, and it might be difficult. You might be in a lot of pain, but at least you'll be still alive. So for 3 weeks, I ate nothing but protein bars, and then again started back into the food, big time into all of the sugar. And that went on for that initial chunk of 2020. And then one day in October, I said to my therapist, I don't know what I'm going to do. You gave me those OA numbers, and at some stage during that 6 months, I had asked her for numbers again. She told me the meetings were online, and I thought she told me, but I know now she didn't tell me. I said, what about I ring those? And she said, that the contact number for, she mentioned a specific meeting in Ireland, is supposed to be very nice. And I rang that person, and she ended up becoming my sponsor. I now know, and that's the start of my being aware of the existence of a higher power. I know that my therapist had no connection to that particular part of Ireland where my sponsor was. She definitely didn't say that to me, but that was the first intuitive thought that I got, to ring that person. And that was, I went to my first meeting on the 29th of October 2020. I started having calls with the person who's now my sponsor. And she started recommending podcasts to me. So I started to listen to Vision for You meetings. We used what was then Surrender School, is now 12 Steps Together. And I attended the Zoom local meetings. So I suppose I became very aware from some of the very first podcasts, basically recordings of Vision for You meetings that she mentioned to me. And one of those was talking about the doctor's opinion and the double whammy. And it was the start of a huge awareness for me of what this disease was. And I wasn't frightened by it. If anything, I was relieved, because up to then, I was just petrified going to bed at night. I used to beg God to get me through the night. My heart would be pounding because I probably grabbed a couple of slices of bread and put burger sauce on those up the stairs. Now, I wouldn't have considered that binging. This was just part of my all day long eating. But I was now aware that this addiction had, a physical side to it and also a mental side to it, that obsession of the mind. But I also realized that, dieting was never going to work for me in the traditional sense, because I was never going to be able to eat any of my foods in moderation again. The second podcast that she recommended I listen to was What Do We Mean by Entire Abstinence? And I'm so glad that I listened and understood those concepts very early on in my recovery, because a year before I'd come in, I had tried the giving up the obvious sugar, and that wasn't going to work for me. That type of abstinence wasn't going to do anything for me. So even as I read through, or as I listened to those podcasts, I was already scribbling down notes on what I would consider my red foods to be and my green foods. I don't have yellow foods, they're either red or green. I also understood that to be at the size that I was at, and I suppose to show the physical before and after, I'm not sure if people can see those. To be at that size, it wasn't just about sugar or flour, like both of those are an issue, but also for me, volume. And I suppose that was the start of me putting that food plan together with a sponsor who then went on to read the big book with me. So for me, if I think about what was I like, before all of this happened. So physically, you can see there on the screen, that's me in the two pictures on the right in 2020. One is in August 2020, and one I think is in around October time, very close to me going into the program. And I suppose the reason I've shared the middle one is it just shows what was going on in our house. My husband looks particularly stressed. And the reason that he's stressed is because any day like this would have involved me having a full, running the show. So this is a religious celebration for what was then my 8-year-old. Because of COVID, it didn't happen in May, it happened in August. But in January, which was pre-COVID, I would have been full on perfectionist planning for this event mode, which you could apply to any day of my life. So my husband had to buy a new suit before he got busy on the farm. My son had his suit, you might be able to see from there, but the material on their dicky bow and tie are matching, as are their handkerchiefs. But me, no, no, no. I had all these great plans that the weight was going to miraculously fall from my body, but it didn't. You can be sure it probably increased at that time. And there's a lot of pain going on because I would have been annoying him about this and that. Now it would have been more scaled down because of COVID, but he would have been thinking about our eldest similar event and the type of show running that was going on. I had to get steroid injections before that particular day to enable me to walk because the pains in my knees were affecting me so much. But oh my God, would he have suffered during that time? So I can really see that now looking back, that he's a little bit tense because it's like, oh Jesus, what way is this day going to be? And as in the other photo, even though I'm there on the beach, lucky to live in a lovely coastal area. This is before I think they were announcing a lockdown. It's very close to me coming into the program. He's happier there. We're outside, but you can see physically at this stage I'm at my highest weight, but I possibly didn't weigh myself at the top of it. I'm nearly 23 stone, so yeah, 320 pounds, 145 kilos. So it's serious. It's really serious. I had three, young children. My youngest was 6 at the time, and my oldest was coming up to 11. Yeah, or 12, sorry, she's 15. So yeah, so what happened? So yeah, I got I got a sponsor, and the first part was the food. So the getting entirely abstinent, having a food plan for me, because of where I was at with volume, I weighed and measured my food, and I continued to weigh and measure my food and send my food plan to my sponsor because I know that this disease is alive and kicking. I remember one day getting strawberries for my lunch and working out how many I was to have based on the weight of the packet. And I put one in my mouth and it was bad. I hadn't noticed it. And I put it down. I thought, you nearly need 5 of those now to compensate for the bad one. I thought, there it is. That's how it would start. It would start with something really innocent, like an extra few strawberries. And I had to say, no, that whatever it was, 10 or whatever I was to have, that was my portion. Why would I have any more? I would have one for the one that bad one I wasn't eating, but I wouldn't have any more. So I'm that sure that that's how it would change. And so I started working the steps with my sponsor. I mean, the change in my physical shape has happened over that photo on the left is from last year. So, I've lost over 150 pounds or 70 kilos. And that's me on the right, because I showed it to somebody and they thought thought it was our third child. He's just not in the photo because he would be standing in front of me in any of the similar photos that we have. So it's not that I've disowned him or anything. But yeah, so what changed? So for me, it was understanding the threefold nature of the disease, that, there's the mental element, so that today I'm abstinent. So if I was to pick up something, it wouldn't be because the physical side of the disease is calling me. It would be because mentally something would go through my head. Sure, couldn't you just have? Why can't you do? Aren't you healthy now? Isn't it Christmas? Isn't it whatever? And that would happen if I'm not in fit spiritual condition. So that's where the spiritual side of the program has been so important for me. So working the steps. And if I look, I read the big book, or my sponsor read the big book with me. I went to the meetings. And when I look at the doctor's opinion, when I read that, I went, wow, that's it. It says on XXVIII, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is the manifestation of an allergy. The phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker, in our case, in the normal eater. And I could agree absolutely with that. And, then in the chapter, there is a solution, where it talks about, before we take that first bite, we're abstinent or we're sober. So it's the mental obsession. And this chapter on page 25 in italics, there is a solution. So absolutely there is a solution. It's not a diet, it's a new way of living. And almost none of us liked. So, this program is simple. It's easy for me to sit here and say, just follow the steps. It's simple, but it's not always easy. Like, none of us liked the self-searching, the leveling of our pride, the confession of shortcomings which the process requires for its successful consummation. So I didn't like the idea of doing a lot of the work at the start. When my sponsor said to me, make a couple of outreach calls a day, I thought, what? Ringing strangers? Has she any idea? I'm not doing that, until I spoke to somebody and they said, I was nearly going to change sponsor when I heard that. And then the penny dropped that it wasn't just my sponsor recommending this. This was a common enough thing among sponsors, and it's something that I do myself today. Equally with step 4, I list the resentments. I'd spent a year and a half in therapy, which I now know reaming off resentments against everybody. My step 4 was like my family tree. And I became abstinent on the 1st of November 2020, and my husband's appendix ruptured when I was in the middle of writing my step 4, so he was hospitalized. I kind of thought I'd having a laugh, so he was in hospital and he was straight there on my step 4. But I now know that it was God showing me that life was going to get in my way. Life was still going to happen. So this wasn't going to be a guarantee of, the serenity wasn't because, things weren't going to be difficult. Absolutely not. But it was God showing me that despite being here, I didn't even like being in the house without another adult, and having to do whatever I needed to do to get the children whenever I have a full-time job. It didn't matter. I was still going to be able to get through it. And I just prayed all the harder. And at night when I had the children in bed, I came in here and I wrote my step 4. I did my step 5 with my sponsor, 10 days after I started, just as we had scheduled. And it was all fine. It was absolutely fine. And in that, I started to see the pattern of my character defects. And I realized that it wasn't the pity party that I thought it would be. And on page 60, which is where I describe the start of that spiritual awakening and that psychic change, where it talks about the fact is the first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. On that basis, we are almost always in collision with something or somebody, even though our motives are good. And my motive was often good, as is the case with other people. But when I looked deep enough, I realized there was a lot of ego at play. And I was absolutely, not only was I wanting to run the show here in this house, but in my sister's house, where my parents were, my sister-in-law, probably at work, the shopkeeper, everybody. I was an expert on how you should live your life if you would only listen to me. And like, if you had my life, you'd be eating too. If you had children throwing clothes on the floor, why wouldn't you eat? What was the other option? Whereas I now realize, that that's just life. That is just life. And today that still happens. They haven't turned into the perfect family by any means. But, I either let it go because I'm in a good place, or if not, I come in here and I write a step 10 on it. Absolutely. And I now have a new way of living. So that's been the change. It's not that everybody around me has changed. They have changed to a certain extent. And they've changed because I've changed, because this is now a calmer place to live. But the main change has been that I now realize that God is running the show. I still see my therapist on a weekly basis, and we normally meet on a Monday, but because I had a work meeting, we met today. And she happened to say to me, have you ever looked back and seen that even though I still have a lot of work to do, have you ever looked back at how far you've come? And I said to her, I have. I absolutely have. I know there are things that I'm probably going to have fears and resentments about in the future, but I know that they'll be okay. Um, and part of me knows I may be resentful if my daughter doesn't make it onto a squad that she's trying out for. But I know I'll be okay, because I know from experience that I will be able to do a step 10 on it. I know the night before the email comes out, I will be able to do that. And that in itself is soothing. It means I don't even have food thoughts about it. I suppose the other fairly major happening in my life has been my dad's illness and subsequent death. His appendix ruptured too, coincidentally, in 2020. And he had Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia, which really deteriorated. And during all of that time, I felt the presence of God with me, and it enabled me to be there for my mother during his illness. and to accept at times when I really didn't want to accept the deterioration of this disease. And I suppose the parent that I most identified with and was closest to. But he said to me, he was the first person to notice my physical change very early on. And then last in Christmas 2022, which was 4 months before he died, and he wasn't particularly lucid that day, but he did say to me, you've kept the tonnage off. That's the way he liked to describe it, because he liked to eat a little bit himself. He was probably a moderate eater. And he said to me, we were so worried about you. He said, I don't have to worry anymore. Sorry, I get emotional every time I say this, because I didn't realize at the time it was his last Christmas. And he said, now we can look forward to your life. And I suppose for me, my mother says that to me a lot. And even shortly after my dad died, I was with him as he died, and that for me was God. He woke me that morning. He had been dying for a couple of weeks, and I woke at 2:30 a.m. and God told me to go to him, which I did. He was about an hour's drive away. And my sister went home. We didn't realize he was as close to death. And he passed away with me there. And it was really spiritual. And a lot of what happened in the lead up to those days was very spiritual. And my mother and my brother and sister got there, in the minutes after he died. And as we sat there, I remember recounting that conversation on Christmas Day where he had said to me, I don't have to worry anymore. And that was it. It wasn't that everyone around me wanted, a daughter that could be, in a modeling clothes or whatever. They were worried about me and my health. My mother, particularly because of my young children, my husband, because he just feared me having a heart attack. And dad just saying, I don't have to worry about you anymore. I can look forward to the future. So I know that he died happy that he didn't have to worry about me. And my mother often says to me, it's a miracle what has happened. I haven't even told her I'm in OA. She just knows something has happened. And she said for me, I never stopped praying that, that this would happen. And that's what keeps me going, that God eventually brought me to OA. It may have taken 45 years, but I got here. And I feel that presence of God every day in my life, this higher power. I came in with a belief in a God, but not the one that I lean on today. It's a very different relationship. And somebody once told me how they identified this little inner voice, separated that from the higher power. And they said, the first voice that you hear is yourself. And I often hear that, oh, there, you're being lazy. Oh, there, look at that happening. And the second one is like, no, it's not. I'm here. I'm taking care of you. And it's that second thought. That's the intuitive one. It's a very caring one. It's not that critical voice that I had assigned to God pre-program and pre-recovery. And I'm just really grateful that it has really helped me to accept everything that has happened. And, a woman from the village where I live, who has unfortunately lost a husband and a number of her children over the years, said to my sister shortly after my father died, they're always with you. You don't ever lose them. And my mother has said that to me. She said, I can feel your dad with me. And I feel like I've gained almost an extra dimension to my higher power. Because, I can ask him questions, and I can feel, the tone of my higher power being, almost of a similar tone in the way that my father would have spoken to me. And like I said, I really felt the presence of God during the later days of his illness, even from,
2 minutes.
That thanks, Roy, from that message to go to him, to even when he was, the day that his appendix ruptured, I was here, had no intention of going, and I got this very clear thought: go to Dad. I think they need you. And like my sister said, we knew you'd be the one to make the decision on calling the ambulance. And another day before he died, when I was there with him, 3 weeks before, when he got seriously ill and we didn't realize he was sick, and the doctor asked me, are we going to treat him or are we going to just leave him here? And my mother turned to me, what do you think? But God sent a paramedic into the room who made the call for me. So look, there are so many examples, and for me it's proof that God is there when we seek him. But in hindsight, I could see he was there all along. There were times that he was there, taking care of me, but I've been ever conscious of his presence. So yeah, I finished up with that, and thanks to everybody for listening. So take care.